Dear Mariellen, I'm especially proud that you are here with us here at the Paderborn Center of the History of Women Philosophers. It is you who encouraged me and who also helped us to build up this Center of the History of Women Philosophers. But the history between you and me is much longer, and I would like to think about how it came, because it is a part of all that development. Now the Center of the History of Women Philosophers at the Paderborn University has already reached a certain audience, and several people know what we are doing here. And I'm very grateful because you have accompanied our center and all its endeavors from the very first steps on. But it was in 1987 when you published the first volume of your finally 4-volume History of Women Philosophers. And I saw the book and I thought, this is it. And I started to try to meet you and to talk to you. And I was able, finally, in 1998, when we first met,
Yes.
I went to the Boston World Congress with a 4-month-old baby, only to see you, to meet you. We had a very short meeting there, and I would like you to tell us, how did it come that you started this 4-volume History of Women Philosophers?
Well, Ruth, thank you for inviting me to be here today and to meet with our audience. And yes, I do remember that first meeting. It was a long time ago. But how did I begin the work? I began the work by accident. I was finishing my doctoral thesis at the University of Minnesota and on the subject of medical paternalism. And I was a philosopher in residence at Bellevue Hospital Psychiatric Prison Ward in New York City, teaching ethics to psychiatrists who evaluated criminals, mostly assassins, for their competency to stand trial. I was invited by the City University of New York Graduate Center to give a talk to them. And I arrived early. It was a hot, steamy July afternoon. I arrived early and decided to go and sit someplace cool, and that turned out to be their small little library in the basement. I was going to read the New York Times and just relax before my talk, and I look up, and on the shelf, a title leaps out at me, and it says, Bibliography of Philosophy. I said, okay. I got up, took the Bibliography of Philosophy, sat down, thumbed through it, and after I passed a certain page, it clicked what I had read. It said, Historia Mulierum Philosopharum. Now, my Latin never was any good, but I thought I knew what that meant. History of women philosophers in Latin. So I went back through the book and looked at it, and sure enough, there was this entry about this book called History of Women Philosophers, written in the mid-1600s, I believe.
1690.
Late 1600s.
Yeah.
And by Gilles Ménage, Frenchman. And all there was bibliographic information about it. So I didn't know what the contents were. And back then, of course, the term philosopher was used to mean many, many different things. Sometimes just thinker. Sometimes it was a psychology or anthropology or even gynecology that was truly the subject of a woman who might be called a philosopher. But it took me a year to get a copy of Ménage's 400-year-old work, 300-year-old work, and sure enough, many of his entries were about women who were philosophers from Antiquity through to about his time, And so I started tracing down the source materials that he himself used, which meant I was looking for materials that was very, very old. And
But what encouraged you to undertake this tremendous work? I'm asking for that because I think even today, the history of the ancient women in philosophy, and this was also the reason for me, what took me so very much. Even today, the history of the ancient women in philosophy, this is a very important point in the history of philosophy, because usually the history of philosophy does not start, with women in philosophy. But the real philosophy, as we know, does, because Plato refers to these women. So what did you give the courage to start a book and then a series?
Well, first I thought I was just going to write a neat little article. But the psychological motivation was different than the philosophical or historical motivation. Okay. The psychological motivation dates to when I was an undergraduate at Hunter College in the city of New York in the 1960s. And I had completed all of the coursework required for philosophy, all 40 credits plus. And I'd taken almost every philosophy course they offered and had mostly A's. And I was required to have a form signed by the chairman of the department to allow me to graduate as a major in philosophy. So I took this form. Back then there were carbon copies. That tells you how old I am. I took this form with me to an appointment with him, and I asked him to sign and showed him my grades. And he said no, he would not sign. And I said, why? He looked me straight in the eye and said, because you will just get married, have babies, and waste it.
But this even happened to me in 1998 when I expected my daughter. The professor I was appointed to, he told me, he said, Ruth, you have to decide yourself to become a philosopher or a mother.
Yes. So this was normal, and it was perfectly legal back then to discriminate in that way, and we had no choice but to accept it. So like any mature 20-year-old, I walked out of his office angry, wishing him dead. 6 weeks later, his karma came and kicked him in the ass, and he died. And I became the first philosophy major. So fast forward from the 1960s to early 1980, when I discovered Jean Ménage's work, I wondered, how did women get to be philosophers? It was so difficult for me to do philosophy or to get credit for doing philosophy. How did women get to be philosophers in Antiquity? Of course, we're talking about a period before there were any universities, and when study was very organized in a very different way than it was today. And as you rightly mentioned, whether we start with Plato or go back well before Plato to Pythagoras and to Theano and Demo and Maya, his spouse and followers, possibly his daughters, we don't know, who all were reported to have written philosophy.
And this is one point, I think, which we will perhaps mention various times. I always felt that the European tradition is different, although in both traditions, the European tradition and the Anglo-American tradition, women have been excluded from the university studies and so on. But when I started to study, and I did my master's on Diotima and the Diotima speech in Plato, because when I found Diotima, it was evident for me that I had to work on Diotima, because my life and also my philosophical life, my philosophical education, when I studied at Munich, even in the history of natural philosophy, where my teacher had Konrad Martius as his professor, so we encountered every step we made, we encountered women. I think within the European tradition, nobody, no student, no female student could deny that she met women in the history of philosophy, but they ignored it. I hold that they actively said, no, I don't devote my studies to that woman because she does not gain, and I cannot gain any importance if I want to become somebody in the institutions. So, but I would always hold somehow that the European tradition was never without knowledge of the women's tradition. So it is, Aspasia is a common name to us in our tradition. Diotima is a common name to us. We are surrounded by paintings, by stories of these women. Christina of Sweden, all these names, we are familiar to a certain extent with that. And I think in your position, as America, let's say the University America, has only developed at the end of the 19th century, more or less, with various studies. And so it is easier to understand, let's say, that this history that was only invented and institutionalized as a patriarchal history. But the European history includes all these women, and it is a different approach because the negation of these women in that history was an active act, a very active act. It was not an act of being forgotten only or simply forgotten. It was an active forgetting of these women, and in a very latent, one can say that, latent way, in a sublime way, sublime way, these women were present,
I think that there were two closely related factors in the European tradition as I understand it. One is that there were, in fact, very few women philosophers compared to the number of male philosophers. So you have a question of population. Then, number two, you have a question of who are the historians. There always was a group of historians who preserved, to some extent, mention, at least, if not the works of, or contributions of, all of the philosophers of the past, men as well as women. And then there always were these misogynist historians who seemed to take the position that if it was a female author, could not be of any interest or could not be philosophically interesting, and they simply skipped over it.
I absolutely agree. There are bibliographies in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, the American bibliographies in the history of philosophy that do not mention not one woman in the history of philosophy.
I think that one of the chief among those are the amazing series by Father Copleston, an amazing series that was available in paperback as well as hardback, and every library has every edition of them. To his credit, he was an excellent historian. To his discredit, he was a horrible historian. There are only two explanations that I can understand as to why someone who used all of the ancient and medieval sources that he in fact used should, every single time he comes across mention of a woman philosopher in those ancient encyclopedias, such as the Pseudolexicon, the Florilegium, and earlier ones we're talking about 9th century and earlier. Every time he comes across the name of a woman, he should skip over and go to the next. There are only two explanations. One, either he is a lousy historian, or he is horrifically sexist. Now, clearly he's not a lousy historian, because he got all the guys. So he's horribly sexist. And when that type of work becomes the foundation then for the college textbooks and for the anthologies that students read, for the journal articles that students read, by which we then create the next generation of philosophy professors, it does not take long for women to simply wash out of the history of philosophy. Now, this happened in the West, of course. It happened in the East also, to a lesser extent, I think. But I do have to say that in particular in Germany, there were some scholars, some encyclopedists, such as Hermann Diaz and Kantz, who, and others, who were fine scholars who preserved not only mention of these women philosophers, but also their writings.
Yes.
And it is they whom I have to thank for finding much of the material that I found that was simply omitted.
Wonderful.
And not only omitted from what I learned, but from what all of my professors and all of their professors had learned, to the point that we were now 4 or 5 or 6 generations of philosophers who were completely ignorant of the contributions of women, although some names survived, like Aspasia and Diotima, Christine of Sweden. But then they were relegated to not really being philosophers, but being characters in a Platonic novel.
Yes.
Plato wrote one novel,
Yes,
and it happened to be the Symposium.
Let's get us into that, because this is really of importance. But let me first ask you, because this was something I understood which was not the typical way of American scholarship, that you wrote a history. And I'm very happy that you mentioned these grounds and our certain kind of tradition in the history of philosophy, which I would like to take up with this center. And it seemed to me that you're writing a 4-volume history of women philosophers. It had a quite different character, than the typical Anglo-American analytical way to go to the problems. And this is what I like. Did you understand yourself and your work and your way to narrate this story also in this difference to the analytical?
If I credit my luck, my success, whatever you might want to call it, I credit it by my training. And my training is this. I was never trained as a historian, and that is to my benefit. I was never trained as a historian. Consequently, I had no idea where to look. So I looked everywhere. I literally went through every single book on every single shelf of a number of state university libraries in the United States. These are the very biggest libraries we have. And looking inside books, no matter what the title was, because works by women that were philosophical works would be bound inside other works, okay? My training comes from 2 important female sources. One, as a child, Americans will know this, as a child, I read the Nancy Drew mystery series. As I became a teenager, I graduated to reading Agatha Christie. And that is my training. Learning how, that's my training. Learning how to ask the right questions, learning how to see what was not visible, learning how to look where others don't look, and not following the rules.
This sounds very Platonic, to discover the world behind the world as it seems to be. And it brings us back to Plato and to this kind of, let's say, start within philosophy. You already mentioned Theano and the Pythagorean women, where we have a large tradition. And you talked about Diotima and Aspasia. So we have now, today, we experience that many people do not know their histories, or they believe simply the world they are living in, and I think this is the whole world. And we have the problem, the very philosophical problem, that we always only know partly and never know the whole story. But today we have so many people accepting the part of the world they know. And
well, Ruth, I think you're quite right. The example that I often use is that if we take the traditional male-only histories of philosophy. We take the traditional male-only histories of philosophy and we put them all together. We, like pieces in a puzzle. We get a puzzle that has a certain picture. Now, let us assume that we find another box of puzzle pieces, and all of those pieces are women. We take them all, we dump all these pieces on the table, along with the pieces that form the male puzzle. But now, all these pieces fit together to form a different picture. That different picture is the history of philosophy.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
You can get one picture by just putting the men together.
Yes.
But in fact, there never was a period in time, ever, that women philosophers were not part of the same schools and traditions that the male philosophers were part of.
Yes.
I have found only 2 women philosophers out of more than 200, dating back to about 5000 BC. I found 2 women out of more than 200 who did philosophy seemingly in isolation, not in the company of males or a particular school of philosophy. Only 2.
So I agree.
The
I
rest
absolutely
were part of
agree.
these schools.
I absolutely agree, and I would insist, like you, that when philosophy flourished, there were the women in these conversations on philosophy. Absolutely, I agree. What I wanted to say with the ups and downs is to make us understand that there are times in history when philosophy as a whole was brought out and its importance was cut down, and there are also epochs in the history of philosophy, I would say, after Kant, which became really and actively misogynist. Read Hegel, read Fichte. It is a very interesting part reading, for example, Fichte, because he has to justify himself against the Enlightenment claim of women to be equal. And he says, yes, they are equal, but they are different. This new sentimentalism in the German philosophy. And so we can really indeed, or think of Plato, let's go back to Antiquity, think of the differences between Plato and Aristotle. It was absolutely necessary that Plato, for himself, that he stood in to make women equal. And he said there will never be a state if women and slaves are not educated and brought out and are not made equals in that sense.
Yes,
and he said,
but despite that, Plato's female students had to attend in drag lest they upset the male students. So there's a limited feminism.
Mary Ellen, I would say these are narrations from much later.
Yes.
Second, this may also be, these are material facts, this may also be for a sort of protection chosen by themselves and so on. Because all the intellectual things I can't find. Indeed, there are so many also feminist interpretations of Plato, and I think my reading of Plato is a clear reading that you have to bring in women. From all what he's saying. And this is what Aristotle is standing up against. And he says, no, we think the use of humans from their functions, and then he comes to a very different understanding of what is the role of women and males as a sex and so on. And the sexist idea enters now philosophy, and this is what Plato actively wanted to bring out and says philosophy is not about the material givenness in time of the hic and of the here and now and what it is. Because what it is, it only seems to be, you know. But there are so many misinterpretations, I think, on Plato. But let's go back. Why is it? So we are talking about the history of philosophy and the many gaps, and as you said, we have to mix it up. Mm-hmm. So why is it? What do you think? What is the answer when we are? You are very often asked, I'm sure, as I am, so why do we need now the history of women philosophers? What will change in narrating, in telling our history of philosophy when the women are in?
We don't know. It's too early to tell. We are now at the point where a certain amount of collection and identification of works by and about women philosophers has been done. We are at the point where some of their works now have been translated into modern languages, mostly English, but not exclusively. And then we need generations of scholars who will study those works, interpret those works, think about them in relationship to other works both before and after by other scholars in that place and time and in other places and time. It's simply too early to tell. But unless we do the work of analyzing, reproducing, analyzing, translating, discussing in scholarly conferences that you arrange, such as the ones that you arrange, where scholars come together and discuss these texts, we don't know what the impact is yet. So it's too early to tell. And until we do that work, we won't know.
I think that simply the insight that there was a culture, and there are many cultures, it is a reflection. We also can say it is a reflection within the Western tradition now to reflect itself critically and to say, we must realize and recognize that we have omitted a whole tradition, and we are starting to understand that this was an active process to bring them out, because many of these women were within certain epochs, as we have already said. So this critical self-reflection of its own history, which is starting now, I would say mostly within the Western tradition again, and not so much because there are many patriarchal traditions around us who insist exactly in that moment, that the patriarchal tradition is the right tradition. And this we have to be aware also when we are looking around in our world. So I think it is also a metaphysical point of view, not only to discover them, to speak about the contents that will come out from this new experience in reading, but the metaphysical insight that we have written a history of philosophy written by philosophers that was actively written wrongly.
Yes.
This is
as a profession, we've been living a lie for 4,000 years.
Not for 4,000. I come back to Plato. And
2,000 years.
It has not only been Plato. We can talk about many philosophers. And we should point to that there have been many male philosophers in that tradition that have pointed to the fact that there are important women, as you have already said. This is not only and has not remained only in uniquely Plato. There were several of them, Condorcet and Voltaire and even Kant to a certain extent. Throughout history. In the 19th century they became more, and Stuart Mill and others. And there were these women who said, already like Marie de Gournay, she said already in 1622, we have to differentiate the histories of philosophy. Those history of philosophy who tell the true history of philosophy and who do not use speaking philosophically to offend women. And those philosophers who understand that women are part of our research into truth and philosophy and so on. This is very important because it is not that we started for the very first time to understand that there is a history of philosophy, also women in philosophy, but there have been various philosophers, males and females, who knew that, like the Chilmenage, who was a friend of this Marie de Gournay. And I would insist again, reading Marie de Gournay already in 1620, in the 20s, she understood that this patriarchal philosophy has made a big mistake in philosophical and metaphysical issues. She said, these are all the worst philosophers and theologians who say that God can be a male. And whenever you talk to a theologian, he knows that it can't be that God is a male. You know, it simply cannot be. If God is everything, he can't be a male.
Exactly.
But nonetheless, in all religious practices, they say, my God, Kyrie, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and she found that now 600 years ago or 500 years ago. So the history will completely change. But for me, it is a question: how will we be able to welcome and to make this revolution in our thoughts fruitful? Because I don't want to have a Robespierre revolution.
Well, I think, unfortunately, this brings us back to my being unable to be a philosophy major. Sometimes you have to wait for idiots to die. Okay? So, if we have historians of philosophy, and if we have philosophy professors who are so lazy that they can only learn philosophy by reading certain very brief histories, then they're not good philosophers, and they're certainly not scholars at all. And in a sense, because they are not good philosophers, why are they not good philosophers? Because they fail to do the one thing philosophy can do. Philosophy's only gift is to ask the right questions, and this they have not done, about their own discipline. And what's the right questions? Well, who are the philosophers? And clearly, they are not only the males. So contemporary philosophers who have failed to do the one thing that philosophy is good at, asking the right question, have failed to ask the right question about the history of their own discipline. And the right question is, who are the philosophers? The answer is men and women. Always have been, always will be, still is that way. So they are not good philosophers. Why would we bother listening to them if they're not good philosophers? I wouldn't. I don't. Unfortunately, they hold positions of power within the profession. And sometimes there's nothing that you can do other than wait for those stodgy, old, white dudes to die.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen, for being with me here and having this conversation on Diotima. I'm looking very much forward to further conversations which we will have with the experts on the history of women philosophers. See you next time.
Thank you, Ruth.